I've been spending a lot of time lately just walking through the older parts of my city and looking up at the buildings. I'm not talking about the glass and steel towers we see today, but the ones built in the 1800s. I find myself asking a very simple question that I can't quite get out of my head. Why does a building from 200 years ago look so much more complex, durable, and frankly, impossible to build compared to what we make today? We are told that we are currently at the peak of human technological progress. We have massive cranes, laser cutters, 3D printing, and software that can calculate every bolt and beam. Yet, when I look at a modern office block, a simple concrete box covered in glass, and then look at an old granite cathedral or a government palace, I reason that something isn't right. I wonder why, with all our machines, we seem to have moved toward what I call concrete minimalism, while people who supposedly only had horses and hand chisels were creating masterpieces that we wouldn't even attempt today. I ask myself why we are so comfortable with the explanation that it was just cheap labor. When I look at the sheer scale of the stone blocks used in buildings from the early 19th century, I wonder how thousands of men with hammers could achieve such perfect symmetry. If you look closely at the columns of some of these older buildings, especially the ones made of solid granite or marble, the surface is often polished to a mirror finish. I reason that if I wanted to polish a massive granite pillar today, I would need high-speed diamond grinders and a lot of electricity. I find it interesting to think about how they achieved this on a mass scale across the entire world using only manual friction. What if the tools they were using weren't as primitive as we are told? Or perhaps, I ask, did they have a way of working with stone that we have simply forgotten? I've been looking at the timelines of some of the most famous structures from that era. Take St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg, or the various Capitol buildings across the United States. When I read the official history, I see that these massive structures, with their enormous domes and intricate stone carvings, were often completed in 10, 20, or 30 years. On the surface, that sounds like a long time. But then I compare it to modern infrastructure projects. I think about how long it takes to build a single subway line or a modern highway bridge today, with all our technology. I wonder why it seems like they were building much faster 200 years ago than we are now. If you factor in the time it takes to quarry the stone, transport it without trucks or railways, and then carve it by hand, the math starts to feel a bit strange to me. I ask myself if it's possible that we are actually slower and less efficient today despite our advanced tools. I also find it curious to look at the sheer amount of detail on those old facades. There are statues, friezes, and complex geometric patterns on every corner. Today, we are told that we don't do this anymore because it's not the style, or because it's too expensive. But I reason that if it was a matter of cost, then the people of the 1800s, who were supposedly much poorer and had less technology, should have been the ones building simple, plain boxes. Instead, they did the opposite. They spent an incredible amount of energy on things that weren't strictly necessary for the building to function. I wonder why every post office, every bank, and every train station built in the 19th century looks like a palace, while our modern equivalents look like shipping containers. It makes me ask if the minimalism we see today is actually a choice, or if we simply no longer have the capability to produce that level of detail at scale. Another thing I've been thinking about is the materials. We use a lot of reinforced concrete today. It's cheap and fast, but we all know it doesn't last very long. After 50 or 60 years, the iron inside starts to rust, the concrete cracks, and the building has to be torn down or majorly renovated. But when I look at the stone buildings from 200 years ago, they look like they could stand for another 1,000 years. I wonder why we traded permanence for temporary structures. I ask myself what kind of society builds things to last for centuries, and what kind of society builds things to last for a few decades. I find it interesting to reason that maybe the people of the past had a different understanding of time and value than we do. They weren't just building for themselves, they were building for a future they believed in. I've been reading about the official methods for moving the massive stones used in these buildings. We are often told about systems of ropes, wooden rollers, and thousands of horses. I try to visualize that in my head. I imagine a 600-ton granite block being pulled through muddy, unpaved streets by hundreds of horses. I wonder how they coordinated that. I ask myself how the wooden rollers didn't simply crush under the weight. When I look at the precision with which these blocks are fitted together, often so tightly that you can't even fit a razor blade between them, I reason that the rope and pulley explanation feels a bit thin. What if there was a technology for softening stone or moving heavy weights that was lost during the Industrial Revolution? It sounds like a big leap, but I ask why we find it easier to believe that people with no electricity did the impossible, rather than considering that they might have had knowledge we don't have. I also find it strange how similar these buildings are, no matter where they are in the world. Whether you are in London, Washington, D.C., Buenos Aires, or even Mumbai, the architecture of the 19th century follows the same, classical, patterns. You see the same columns, the same domes, and the same decorative motifs. I wonder how this style became so globally dominant before the age of the internet or easy international travel. I ask myself why every major city on Earth seemed to be building the exact same type of massive, high-tech stone structures at the exact same time. We are told it was just a fashion that spread, but I reason that it's a very difficult fashion to follow if you have to ship architectural plans by boat and carve everything by hand in different climates with different types of stone. I've started looking at old photos from the mid-1800s, right when photography was first being used. I find it very interesting to look at the cities during that time. Often, you see these massive, incredibly complex buildings surrounded by muddy roads and people still using horse-drawn carriages. The contrast is what gets me. It looks like the people are living in a world they didn't fully build themselves. It's like finding a modern smartphone in a medieval village. I ask myself, if they had the technology to build a massive stone cathedral with perfect acoustics and heat distribution systems, why were they still struggling with basic sanitation and mud streets? I wonder why the level of architectural technology seems to be so far ahead of the general level of daily life at the time. I've also been thinking about the lost art of stonemasonry. We are told that we just don't have the craftsmen anymore. But I ask, why did we let that skill die out? If you have a skill that allows you to create something beautiful and permanent, why would a whole planet decide to stop doing it all at once? I reason that usually, when a technology is superior, it stays. We didn't stop using light bulbs to go back to candles. So, if the stone building technology of the 19th century was so good, why did we switch to concrete and glass? Some say it's because of the world wars or the need for rapid housing, but I wonder if there's more to it. What if the transition wasn't a choice, but a necessity because we could no longer maintain or replicate the old ways? I find it fascinating to look at the interiors of these old buildings as well. They aren't just pretty on the outside. The way they handle light, the way the air moves through them, and the way sound travels is often superior to modern designs. I've been in old libraries where you can hear a whisper from across the room, and I wonder how they calculated those acoustics without computer simulations. I ask myself if they were using a different kind of science, maybe something based on geometry and natural frequencies that we don't study in the same way today. I reason that if you look at the floor plans of many 19th century buildings, they look remarkably like modern circuit boards. I wonder if that's just a coincidence, or if the shape of the building served a purpose beyond just looking nice. I often think about the great exhibitions and world's fairs of the 1800s. They were these massive events where countries would build entire, temporary, cities filled with incredible palaces and monuments. I find it very strange that they would build something like the Crystal Palace in London or the White City in Chicago, only to tear it down a few months later. The official story is that these were made of cheap materials like plaster and wood, designed to look like stone. But I look at the photos and I ask myself, why go to all that trouble? Why build something that looks like a permanent marvel of engineering just for a 6-month fair? I wonder if those buildings were actually already there, or if they were part of a much larger construction effort that we don't fully understand. The more I look at the foundations of our modern world, the more I reason that we are living in the ruins of a much more advanced civilization, not one from thousands of years ago, but one from just 200 years ago. I ask myself why we feel so superior to them when we can't even replicate their simplest decorative work without it costing a fortune and taking decades. I wonder if the Industrial Revolution was less of a leap forward and more of a pivot away from a different type of technology. We went toward steam, coal, and eventually oil. But I ask, what did we move away from? What if those old buildings were designed to work with a different kind of energy, or a different understanding of the environment? I find it interesting to look at how we renovate these old buildings today. Usually, we can't even find stone that matches the original. We use patches of concrete or plastic resins to fix statues that were carved 200 years ago. I wonder why, with all our chemical engineering, we can't create a material that lasts as long as the stone they were using. I ask myself if we have lost the recipe for certain types of artificial stone or geopolymers that some researchers suggest were used in the past. If they were pouring stone rather than carving it, that would explain a lot of the precision. But then I have to ask, why don't we do that now? If we had a way to pour liquid granite into a mold and have it last for 500 years, every construction company in the world would be using it. The fact that we don't makes me wonder if that knowledge is truly gone. I've been thinking a lot about the speed of construction again. I look at a city like Chicago or San Francisco. Both of them had massive fires in the late 1800s and early 1900s that supposedly leveled the entire city. And yet, if you look at the records, these cities were rebuilt with massive stone buildings in just a few years. I ask myself how that's possible. In an era where everything had to be moved by horse and every brick had to be laid by hand, how do you rebuild an entire metropolis in 3 or 4 years? I reason that even today, with all our logistics and power tools, it would take us much longer to rebuild a city from scratch. I wonder if the buildings were actually destroyed, or if the rebuilding story is a way to explain why the architecture looks so different from the lives of the people who were living there. I'm also curious about the basements of these buildings. Have you ever noticed how many old buildings have windows that are half buried in the ground? They call them light wells. But often these windows lead directly into the dirt, or are placed so low that they would flood every time it rains. I ask myself why a master architect, capable of building a magnificent palace, would make the mistake of putting the first floor 3 feet below the street level. I wonder if the street level wasn't always where it is now. I reason that if you see the same buried windows in Russia, America, and Europe, maybe something happened on a global scale that covered the bottom floors of these buildings in a layer of earth. What if the people 200 years ago weren't building these structures from the ground up, but were actually uncovering and repairing them? I know it sounds like a strange thing to reason, but the more I look at the evidence, the more I ask why the official version of history feels so incomplete. We are told that humanity was primitive, then we had the Renaissance, then the Industrial Revolution, and now we are the best we've ever been. But the buildings tell a different story. They tell a story of a peak that happened somewhere in the 1800s, a peak of craftsmanship, beauty, and scale that we haven't touched since. I wonder why we stopped trying to be great and started trying to be efficient. I ask myself if the loss of this architecture is actually a sign of a decline in our collective intelligence, or our ability to organize. I've been looking at the maps from the 1800s as well. I find it very interesting that even in places that were supposedly unsettled, or wild, you find these massive star-shaped forts and complex stone structures. I ask myself who built them and why. We are told they were built by early explorers or colonial armies for defense. But I reason that the amount of earth and stone moved to create a star fort is astronomical. It would take a modern construction crew with bulldozers months to move that much dirt. I wonder how a small group of soldiers in the wilderness managed it. I ask myself if these structures were already there, and the people we learn about in history were just the ones who found them and moved in. I think about the craftsmanship of a single wooden door from 1850. The joinery, the carvings, the quality of the wood, it's something you would pay a fortune for today. Back then, it seems it was the standard. I ask myself why the standard has dropped so significantly. I wonder if we are being told that minimalism is a style simply because it's the only thing we can afford to produce in a world where real resources and real skills are becoming more and more rare. I reason that if we really had more technology today, our buildings should be more beautiful and more complex than those of the past, not less. I've been looking into the concept of inherited cities. It's an idea that I find very compelling the more I look at the world around me. What if the massive infrastructure we see, the tunnels, the bridges, the palaces, and the cathedrals, was already mostly in place when our current society began its rapid expansion in the mid-1800s? It would explain why the architecture is so consistent globally. It would explain the half-buried windows and the strange speed of construction. I wonder if we are like a new tenant moving into a fully furnished mansion and pretending we built the furniture. I ask myself, if that were true, who were the original builders? And why did they leave? I was looking at the old photographs of the first skyscrapers in New York and Chicago. When you look at the construction photos, you often see the steel frames going up, but you rarely see the foundational work. I wonder why that is. I ask myself if some of those new buildings were actually built on top of much older, much sturdier foundations that were already there. I reason that if I were a builder in 1890, and I found a massive granite foundation in the ground, I would definitely use it. It makes me wonder just how much of our modern world is built on the bones of something much older and much more advanced. I want to look closer at the great fires I mentioned earlier. I ask myself why so many major cities around the world, Chicago, Boston, Baltimore, San Francisco, even places in Russia and Australia, all seem to have these catastrophic fires between 1850 and 1910. Usually, we're told it was just an accident, a cow knocked over a lantern, or a chimney spark. But I wonder why these fires were so destructive to stone buildings. Granite doesn't burn. Marble doesn't burn. Yet, after these fires, we see photos of rubble that looks more like a war zone than the aftermath of a simple fire. I reason that maybe the fires were a way to clear out the old structures that didn't fit the new plan for the world. Or perhaps, I ask, were they a way to hide the fact that the buildings were already there and were being renovated? I've been reasoning that if you want to change the history of a people, you have to change their environment. You have to remove the physical evidence of what came before. I wonder if the shift from stone to concrete was part of that. Concrete is easy to tear down. It doesn't last. Stone is a problem if you want people to forget the past, because it stays there, staring at you, asking you how it was built. I ask myself if our modern, disposable, architecture is a way of keeping us focused only on the present, so we don't ask too many questions about where we really came from. I find it very interesting to think about the pioneer era in the United States and Australia. We are shown pictures of people in log cabins and mud huts. But then, in the same year, in a city just a few miles away, there are massive stone courthouses with 40-foot ceilings and marble floors. I ask myself, how do these two realities exist at the same time? How can a society be struggling to survive in the wilderness while simultaneously building some of the most sophisticated architecture in human history? I reason that the log cabin story might be true for some, but it doesn't explain the palaces. I wonder if there were two different levels of society, or two different eras, colliding in the same space. I've been thinking about the energy it would take to heat those massive buildings in the winter. Most of them have these enormous fireplaces, but I ask myself if a fireplace could really heat a stone hall with 50-foot ceilings. I reason that it would be incredibly inefficient. I wonder if the fireplaces were actually part of a different system. Some people suggest they were part of an atmospheric electricity system or some other form of free energy that the buildings were designed to harvest. It sounds like science fiction, but when I look at the metal spires on the roofs and the intricate ironwork that seems to serve no structural purpose, I ask myself if these buildings weren't actually machines of some kind. Machines that we've forgotten how to turn on. I've started noticing how many of these old buildings have been converted into things they clearly weren't meant for. You see old power stations that are now art galleries, or old warehouses that are now luxury apartments. I wonder why they were built with such beauty and detail if they were just for industrial use. Today, our power stations are the ugliest buildings in the city. But 200 years ago, they looked like temples. I ask myself, why would you put statues and stained glass in a place that just houses machinery? I reason that maybe the machinery they were using was different, or maybe they didn't see a distinction between technology and art. I ask myself why we are so hesitant to admit that we might have lost something important. We are taught that history is a straight line going up, always getting better. But when I look at the facades of the 19th century and compare them to the flat, gray walls of today, I wonder if history is actually a series of peaks and valleys. I reason that we might be in a valley right now, looking back at a peak we can't quite explain. I find it interesting to think about what else we might have forgotten, besides how to carve stone. I've been looking at the sheer volume of classical architecture that was destroyed in the 20th century. During the World Wars, of course, but also during the urban renewal projects of the 50s and 60s. We tore down thousands of these magnificent stone buildings to replace them with parking lots and concrete boxes. I ask myself why we were so eager to get rid of them. We are told they were old-fashioned or inefficient, but I wonder if there was a deeper reason. I reason that if you have a city full of buildings that you can't explain and can't replicate, it's a constant reminder of your own limitations. By tearing them down, we make our own modern achievements look more impressive by comparison. I'm fascinated by the idea of pre-built infrastructure. Think about the massive sewer systems and underground tunnels found in cities like London, Paris, or even New York. When they were supposedly built in the mid-1800s, they were often far larger than the population needed at the time. I ask myself why a city of a few 100,000 people would build a brick sewer system large enough for a city of millions. I wonder if the infrastructure was already there, left over from whatever civilization built the stone palaces above. I reason that it's much easier to explain the rapid growth of the 19th century if the foundations, the roads, the tunnels, the water systems, were already in place for them to use. I also wonder about the statues that cover these old buildings. They are often incredibly realistic, with perfect anatomy and flowing stone drapery. We are told they were carved by hand. But I ask myself, how many master sculptors would you need to produce the thousands of statues we see in just one city like Paris or St. Petersburg? I reason that even a master would take months or years to finish one figure. Yet we see them everywhere. I wonder if they had a way of casting stone or using some kind of photographic process to create these figures. I ask myself why we don't see that level of realism in modern art, even with all our tools. The more I look at the world this way, the more questions I have. I'm not saying I have the answers, but I'm saying that the answers we've been given don't seem to fit the physical reality of what I can see with my own eyes. I ask myself why the concrete minimalist world we live in now feels so hollow compared to the world of 200 years ago. I wonder if we are actually the ones living in a primitive time, despite our computers and our planes. I reason that a society that can't build a beautiful, permanent home for its people has some serious questions to answer. I was looking at a map of a city from 1850 recently, and I noticed something very strange about the industrial areas. They were often located right next to the most beautiful residential palaces. I find it strange because we are told the 19th century was incredibly dirty and polluted, filled with the soot of coal and the waste of horses. I ask myself how people living in these ornate palaces could stand being right next to heavy industry. But then I wonder, what if that industry wasn't burning coal? I reason that if the factories of that time were as loud and smoky as we are told, the wealthy wouldn't have built their masterpieces right next to them. I wonder if their industry was actually something else entirely, perhaps cleaner and more efficient than what we have today. I ask myself why we see so few chimneys in old photographs of these industrial zones, and why the ones we do see often look more like decorative towers than exhaust vents. I also think a lot about the materials they used. Today, we use a lot of concrete and steel, which we are told are the peak of construction technology. But I ask myself why a modern bridge or a high-rise is expected to last only 50 or 100 years before it needs a major renovation. I reason that if we look at the stone structures from the 1800s, they seem almost immortal by comparison. I wonder why we stopped using granite and marble for public infrastructure. We are told it is too expensive or too difficult to work with, but I ask myself how it was affordable for people who supposedly traveled by horse and used hand saws. I reason that if they could pave thousands of miles of streets with perfectly cut stone blocks, they must have had a process that was much more efficient than what we have now. I look at the granite embankments in cities like St. Petersburg or the massive stone foundations in New York, and I wonder how they move these multi-ton blocks. I ask myself where the cranes were that could lift such weights, especially when we are told the tech of the time was so basic. I reason that even today, moving a 100-ton block of granite is a major engineering project. Yet 200 years ago, they seemed to do it as if it were a routine task. I wonder if they had a way to change the weight of objects, or a different method of transport that we haven't rediscovered yet. I ask myself why there are so few drawings or photos showing the actual construction of these massive stoneworks, while we have plenty of photos of the finished buildings. I also find it interesting to consider the unskilled labor we are told built these cities. History books often mention that thousands of peasants, or low-paid workers were used for these projects. I ask myself how an illiterate peasant could carve a perfect Corinthian column or fit stones together with such precision that you can't even slide a piece of paper between them. I reason that this level of work requires not just skill, but advanced mathematical knowledge and precision tools. I wonder if the story of mass peasant labor is just a way to explain away a level of technology that we don't want to admit existed. I ask myself if these workers were actually using some kind of modular, prefabricated system that allowed them to assemble complex buildings quickly. I reason that our modern minimalism might not be an artistic choice at all. I wonder if it is actually a symptom of our inability to do anything else. I ask myself if we call it minimalism because we have lost the ability to create the complex, fractal patterns that covered the buildings of the 19th century. I reason that if you can't do something, you often claim you didn't want to do it in the first place. I wonder if our modern glass boxes are just the best we can do with the limited skills and high costs we face today. I ask myself why we have traded the soul and detail of the past for the cold, flat surfaces of the present. I also wonder about the internal climate of those old buildings. They often have very thick walls and high ceilings. I ask myself how they were heated and cooled so effectively before modern HVAC systems. I reason that the design itself must have been part of the technology. I wonder if the fireplaces we see in every room were actually something else, perhaps part of a system that circulated heat using the building's own structure. I ask myself why so many of these old fireplaces show no signs of soot or smoke damage in their original state. It makes me reason that they might have had a clean way to stay warm that didn't involve burning wood or coal. When I see a new building going up today, I notice how many people and machines are involved. I ask myself why, despite all this, the finished product looks so much more fragile than a library or a post office built in 1880. I reason that we are living in a time of planned obsolescence, where nothing is meant to last. I wonder if the people 200 years ago built for eternity because they had a different relationship with time and resources. I ask myself what it says about our society that we spend billions on buildings that will be torn down in 2 generations, while we still inhabit and admire the ruins of a previous era. I don't have the answers to these questions, but I find it helpful to keep asking them. I wonder if we are actually in a period of recovery after some kind of massive loss of knowledge. I ask myself if the Industrial Revolution was less about inventing new things and more about trying to figure out how to use the things that were already there. I reason that by looking at our cities with fresh eyes, we might start to see the clues of what we used to be capable of. I wonder if the peak of human technology isn't in our future, but in our forgotten past. I ask myself what we could achieve today if we stopped assuming we are the most advanced people to ever live and started really looking at the stones beneath our feet.